I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith, Willard Richards, John Taylor, and some of their closest friends are now in Carthage jail. They spent the night of June 25th to 26th supplicating with the Lord until late in the evening. There they, quote, made Carthage prison into the gate of heaven for a while, end quote. After which the men all, quote, laid promiscuously on the floor where they slept, end quote. The morning of June 26th, these men all awoke, tangled up in each other, with the town of Carthage hustling and bustling about. The militia forces were over 1,300 men in the city by this point, many of whom came from local towns who had a particular affinity for hating the Mormons. Having dealt with the criminal empire of Nauvoo for the past 5 years, maybe that hatred was a little bit justified. This means that some of the highest-ranking leaders of Mormonism, including the prophet and patriarch Jo and Hyrum, they were locked in a jail in hostile territory, incarcerated for the purposes of their own protection. The only insurance these incarcerated men had that vigilante justice wouldn't be served was Governor Ford. Ford's presence during this rising conflict had kept the region from spiraling into civil war so effectively, but Ford was being fed a lot of information, and some of it false, calculated to murder the Smiths, and his circle of trusted militia officers and advisors was shrinking every minute. The Carthage Greys presented a particular problem here. They'd shown tendencies towards violence and mutiny all along, and Ford was having a really hard time keeping the Carthage Greys in line. They'd resisted his commands a few times. They were the most excited when Jo and his posse entered the city on the night of June 24th. They refused to acknowledge Jo and Hyrum as generals when Governor Ford was doing the little meet and greet the morning of the 25th. The Carthage Greys were the greatest existential threat for the prisoners, and Governor Ford knew it. The prisoners knew it. Ford's advisors probably knew it. As Carthage began to hustle and bustle on this morning of June 26th, tensions were pretty high in the city. Jo wanted a meeting with Governor Ford, and he must have thought all along that, hey, if he could just explain himself and his actions the right way to Governor Ford, then this whole confusion would be resolved. Then he'd be allowed to return to Nauvoo unharmed. In spite of what Jo thought, it doesn't matter how you explain criminal acts, they're still criminal. However, there was a jury trial coming up in Carthage to get all of the facts. All 18 city councilors had been released on a collective $7,500 bail to return to Carthage on June 29th for the actual jury trial concerning their decision to declare the expositor a nuisance. Jo and Hyrum, however, were arrested on extra charges of treason for declaring martial law in Nauvoo, which would require a separate criminal hearing. Governor Ford believed the charges of treason would have been legitimate if they were brought in any other place than Carthage, but he also considered this extra charge was calculated to make Jo vulnerable to vigilante justice. So Governor Ford was on high alert. For that matter, everybody was on high alert. At any point, the Nauvoo Legion could come marching into the city, lay waste to it, and rescue their prophet and, commander-in-chief, and thus setting off the Illinois Mormon War. Any of the rogue militias could commit mutiny and march into Nauvoo, and then try their best to, siege the city and attempt to destroy it, bringing out dozens of other militias from all over the state. Governor Ford's presence was the only thing keeping these tensions at simmering instead of boiling over. Jo wanted nothing more than for this case to be transferred out of the circuit court at Carthage. Let's make no mistake here. He was being charged and held in jail by his enemies. He'd acquired those enemies over the course of 5 years because he was a criminal kingpin. But they absolutely were his enemies. He knew that he had a better chance of a fair trial, or at least a trial more favorable to him, if this was handled in Quincy or if it was taken to the state Supreme Court in Springfield. From the History of the Church, quote, at 7:30 a.m., Markham, Wasson, and Jones were severally sent by Joseph with messages to the governor, but at 8 got no return. He also sent word to his council that he wanted a change of venue to Quincy, Adams County, end quote. The crimes hadn't been committed in Adams County. They'd been committed in Hancock County. And Joseph Smith wasn't charged of those crimes in Adams County. He was charged of those crimes in Hancock County, where Carthage and Nauvoo were. The constable, the prosecuting attorney, the jailer, even the governor, they had no legal basis to transfer the case unless they could prove some kind of conflict of interest by the justice by virtue of his being a Carthage citizen. That could possibly be proven, right? But, the justice wanted to handle the case. He wasn't going to recuse himself, and he wasn't going to let this be transferred out of the circuit court at Carthage. That would be a separate legal battle to try and determine a conflict of interest. They would also need to prove a conflict with the prosecuting attorney, and that would be a lot easier because the prosecuting attorney was Chauncey Higbee. He was one of the printers of the expositor who had personally been the victim of the alleged crimes. Neither of these issues would actually be resolved, these conflicts of interest, but that wasn't known at the time, which is why Jo was seeking the venue change to Quincy in Adams County. Now, when these messengers were sent to Governor Ford, Jo and the other prisoners took breakfast with the jailer, a guy named Mr. Stiegel. They seemed to have a lovely conversation. Quote, Joseph and Hyrum had a conversation with the jailer, Mr. Stiegel, who said a week last Wednesday the mob were calculating to have made an attack on Nauvoo, and they expected about 9,000 persons, but only about 200 came. They had sent runners to Missouri and all around the counties in Illinois, end quote. Yeah, calling for an army of thousands of men and only a fraction of them respond to it. Jo could understand what that was like. He called for 5,000 Mormons to join him for the march to Missouri from Kirtland back in 1834 and only ended up with just over 200. It's weird. A call to action, but almost everybody is too lazy to answer the call. I wonder what it's like. So Jo resolved to simply write a personal communication to Governor Ford and ask for this meeting yet again. Quote, His Excellency Governor Ford, Sir, I would again solicit your excellency for an interview, having been much disappointed the past evening, being imprisoned and all. I hope you will not deny me this privilege any longer than your public duties shall absolutely require. We have been committed under a false minimus, and consequently the proceedings are illegal, and we desire the time may be hastened when all things shall be made right, and we relieved from this imprisonment. Your servant, signed, Joseph Smith. P.S. Please send an answer per bearer, end quote. He was done waiting for an answer, so he sent the jailer, Mr. Stiegel, to Governor Ford with this message in hand. Now, a quick note here. The minimus was absolutely not illegal or false. The charges of treason had been alleged by those who'd been unduly burdened by the declaration of martial law in Nauvoo, and the justice of the peace in Carthage was well in his power in merely complying with his legal obligations to issue the minimus to get them incarcerated. They were in Carthage on legitimate charges, and the minimus was valid. So this was either ignorance or lying to try and get out of jail. One quick note as well. What would happen if Jo was allowed to go free from Carthage by direction of Governor Ford? Do you think that Jo would come back to Carthage to attend the criminal hearing if he was released on bail? Or would he take the fact that he was imprisoned in Carthage as a signal that this time his legal troubles meant real business, and he would take that as a signal to raise the Nauvoo Legion immediately upon his return to the city in order to carry out the Illinois Mormon War, which seemed nearly inevitable by this point? If Governor Ford stepped in and nullified the minimus, allowing Jo and his friends to go free, what assurance did Ford have that the law would be complied with from that point forward? Keeping Jo in Carthage jail was the safest thing for everybody at this point. After that communication was sent to Governor Ford, Piggybank Steve Markham and Dan Jones returned from their meeting with Governor Ford, and this is how it's reported in the history of the church. Quote, Markham and Jones returned, stating that the governor said he was taken by surprise last evening when they were arrested. That's what it's referring to. And was very sorry. Was afraid we would think he had forfeited his word about having an interview, that the wrath of the people was about to turn on the head of Joseph H. Jackson, the mob, etc., that the governor was doing as fast as he could, end quote. So maybe Jo and Hyrum and all the guys being incarcerated, maybe that did catch him by the surprise, or maybe that was just the most prudent thing to tell the messengers at that point. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell. But that word was received at 8:30 in the morning, and the jailer, Mr. Stiegel, returned with Ford's written communication in response to Joe's previous letter that he sent. Quote, "The interview will take place at my earliest leisure today, signed Thomas Ford," end quote. With that communication, Joe knew that he would have his conversation with the governor at some point this day. Then he could just explain everything and all of the problems would be dealt with. Immediately after receiving this communication from Governor Ford, Hugh T. Reed, one of Joe's legal counselors in this whole affair, it was Hugh T. Reed and James Woods, Hugh T. Reed came to meet with the prisoners in the jail to discuss the case. Quote, "Mr. Reed and others arrived at the jail and investigated the merits of the case and concluded to take a change of venue before Justice Greenleaf of Augusta, Hancock County, and to send for," and then it lists like 20 men as witnesses that Reed was to send for in order to testify on behalf of Joe, as well as Nauvoo city councils and their conduct concerning the expositor and the resulting protests and riots. Finally, at 9:27 a.m., after Hugh T. Reed and Joe had this meeting about the case, Governor Thomas Ford, 9:27 a.m., with a personal advisor by the name of Colonel Geddes, arrived at Carthage jail to have this long-awaited conversation with the prophet. We're going to spend a lot of time with the history of the church and what it reports was said during this meeting. To set the scene, this conversation between Governor Ford and Joseph Smith, this was Joe's chance to make his case to Governor Ford that he should not be in jail. This was his chance to muster every bit of oratory power and persuasion that he'd cultivated all 39 years of his life, and to get out of just one more scrape with the law. It's reported as a conversation, and I'm going to do my best to emulate how I picture this interaction actually transpiring. And I'm going to do that by changing the pronouns to first person and making it kind of a conversation instead of a report of a conversation from a third-party observer, who were John Taylor, John S. Fulmer, and Whiteout Willard Richards in this case. And I've done a little bit of synthesizing the different accounts into one cohesive conversation. So bear with me. It's going to be a little bit messy, but I'm going to do my best to make it conversative. So here it is from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 6, beginning on page 660. Quote, "Joseph Smith stated to them the origin of the difficulty, the facts relating to the expositor press, the course pursued by the city council, the legality, as we thought, of our legislation, then pledged that I had made by letter and sent by expresses to your excellency that I am willing to satisfy all legal claims in case it should be shown that the city council had transcended our legal bounds, etc., and that the Legion had been called out for the protection of the city, while it was threatened with immediate hostilities by an infuriated mob, until your excellency could afford relief, and not for the purpose of invasion." The governor seemed to be satisfied that this was the truth, but still he did not interfere with their legal imprisonment. Joseph adverted to all the leading causes which gave rise to the difficulties under consideration in a brief but lucid, energetic, and impressive manner. The governor said, "I am satisfied it is the truth." General Smith then read copies of the orders and proceedings of the City Council of Nauvoo concerning the destruction of the expositor press and of the correspondence forwarded to His Excellency in relation thereto, and also informed him concerning the calling out of the Legion and the position they occupied of absolute necessity, not to make war upon or invade the rights of any portion of the citizens of the state, but it was the last resort and only defense in the absence of executive protection against a large, organized, military, and mobocratic foe, end quote. So the very beginning here, this is pretty easily done away with by the simple fact that the Legion was called out by martial law to oppose anybody in the city affecting an arrest of Joe, Hyrum, and the other city councilors. They didn't call out the Nauvoo Legion to oppose a rival militia entering the city, but from vigilantes within the city from effecting vigilante justice for the crimes that were committed by the city council. Joe called out the Legion not to protect the citizens of Nauvoo, but to protect himself and his closest friends after they had committed crimes and abused their power. Now, where Joe is lying is in his intent here. And that's really hard to prove in a court of law, let alone the script of a podcast 180 years in the future from the events that we're discussing here. But I don't see many of Joe's actions as being for the benefit of his followers when the benefit of himself is sufficient to explain his actions. The conversation continues. The governor. General Smith, I believe you have given me a general outline of the difficulties that have existed in the country in the documents forwarded to me by Dr. Bernheisel and Mr. Taylor, but unfortunately, there seems to be a great discrepancy between your statements and those of your enemies. It is true that you are substantiated by evidence and affidavit, but for such an extraordinary excitement as that which is now in the country, there must be some cause, and I attribute the last outbreak to the destruction of the expositor and your refusal to comply with the writ issued by Esquire Morrison. The press in the United States is looked upon as the great bulwark of American freedom, and its destruction in Nauvoo was represented and looked upon as a high-handed measure, and manifests to the people a disposition on your part to suppress the liberty of the speech and of the press. This, with your refusal to comply with the requisition of a writ, I conceive to be the principal cause of this difficulty, and you are moreover represented to me as a turbulent and defiant of the laws and institutions of your county. General Smith reminded His Excellency, the question in dispute was a civil matter, and to settle which needed no resort to arms, and that I am ready at any time, and have always been ready to answer any charge that might be preferred against me, either as Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion, the Mayor of the city, or as a private individual in any court of justice which was unintimidated by a mob or military array, and make all the satisfaction that the law requires, if any, etc. The governor said, I have not called out this force, but found it assembled in military array without my orders on my arrival at Carthage. The laws must be enforced, but you must be protected, and I again pledge my word in the faith and honor of the state that you should be protected. I intend to march my forces to Nauvoo to gratify them. The prisoners should accompany us and then return again to attend the trial before the magistrate, which have been postponed for the purpose of making this visit. End quote. So there's a little bit to tease out here, but let's start with what were the reasons for Governor Ford wanting to take the prisoners to Nauvoo under the guard of his militia, only to return back to Carthage and re-incarcerate them in that prison? All I can do is speculate here, but I have an idea of what might have been running through Governor Ford's head. The people of Nauvoo didn't know what was happening in Carthage. Only the previous day did 16 of the 18 men who were charged with riot return to the city of Nauvoo on bail. And who knows what they said to the other Mormons upon their arrival. Plus, with those 16 back in Nauvoo and then just Jo and Hyrum and a few of their closest cronies still in Carthage, danger was even higher that vigilante justice would leave the smaller group that remained in Carthage of the church leaders dead. Governor Ford had heard so much from the people who hated the Mormons, and also it would benefit everyone if he could get to Nauvoo with Jo on his right hand to hear what was going on in that city from the mouths of its citizens. Now, add into this, the mix of people in Nauvoo represented a mix of desired outcomes, right? The majority of Mormons, they believed the propaganda that was spewed by the leadership, that all of this was the result of mobocrats and anti-Mormons, right? They all wanted their prophet and patriarch, Jo and Hyrum, back in the city to continue to lead the Mormon revolution. But there were also plenty who didn't believe the propaganda and who saw what happened for what it was, a corrupt city government run as a theocracy who destroyed the printing press of a rival church who had called the leadership of the church to repentance and for the wider church to reform. There were plenty who thought the rumors of polygamy were disturbing and plentiful enough that maybe those rumors, they had some merit. And when they read the expositor and had all of those suspicions confirmed, they were infuriated by the revelations contained in the expositor. In some ways, those familiar with history would be regarding the expositor as William Law's 95 Thesis, right? So Governor Ford coming to the city of Nauvoo and showing those folks there that Jo was in the custody of the state, he was working through the proper legal means, that would be a show of good faith in the legal system at large for these folks who generally distrusted the corruption of Nauvoo. Beyond all of that, Governor Ford taking Jo and Hyrum to Nauvoo in his custody, then returning to Carthage with them still in his custody, that would be a massive show of force to the Mormons and the anti-Mormons who were waiting for Governor Ford to be gone so that they could kill Joseph Smith, right? If Ford could pull that off, taking Jo from Carthage to Nauvoo and back to Carthage, if he could pull that off, that would inspire a deep sense of trust in the entire government system and in his office as governor in the minds of all of those people who were running on the crank of fury and anger, which was motivating all their actions at this time. So what would Jo and Hyrum do once in Nauvoo while in the custody of Governor Ford? That was another question entirely. The conversation did continue between Jo and Governor Ford. Quote, Joseph alluded to the coming of Constable Bettesworth when I gave myself up, also to his offer to go before any other justice of the peace, and called upon some 20 bystanders to witness that I submitted to the writ. But for fear of my life, I went to Carthage. I had preferred to go before Esquire Daniel H. Wells, a gentleman of high legal attainments who is in no way connected with the Mormon Church. So, hang on, come on, Jo, right? Couldn't you foresee that would be a win for Satan, calling your own church Mormon in this conversation with Governor Ford? Oh, well, apparently the dude could only prophesy of like really vague stuff at undetermined times in the future instead of anything consequential, like using the correct name of his own church or being on the right side of, slavery. Continuing on. In relation to the writ served upon us, we were willing to abide the consequences of our own acts, but were unwilling in answering a writ of that kind to submit to illegal exactions sought to be imposed upon us under the pretense of law, when we knew they were in open violation of it. When that document was presented to me by Mr. Bettesworth, I offered in the presence of more than 20 persons to go to any other magistrate, either in our city of Appanus or any other place where we should be safe, but we all refused to put ourselves into the power of a mob. What right had the constable to refuse our request? He had none according to law. For you know, Governor Ford, that the statute law in Illinois is that the party served with the writ shall go before him who issued it or some other justice of the peace. Why then should we be dragged to Carthage where the law does not compel us to go? Does not this look like many others of our prosecutions with which you are acquainted? And had we not a right to expect foul play? This very act was a breach of law on his part, an assumption of power that did not belong to him, and an attempt at least to deprive us of our legal and constitutional rights and privileges. What could we do under the circumstances different from what we did do? We sued for and obtained a writ of habeas corpus from the municipal court, by which we were delivered from the hands of Constable Bettesworth and brought before the acquitted by the municipal court. After our acquittal, in a conversation with Judge Thomas, although he considered the acts of the party illegal, he advised that to satisfy the people, we had better go before another magistrate who was not in our church. In accordance with his advice, we went before Esquire Wells, with whom you are well acquainted. Both parties were present. Witnesses were called on both sides. The case was fully investigated, and we were again dismissed. And what is this pretended desire to enforce law and these lying base rumors put into circulation for, but to seek through mob influence under the pretense of law to make us submit to requisitions that are contrary to law and subversive of every principle of justice? And when you, sir, required us to come out here, we came not because it was legal, but because you required it of us. And we were desirous of showing to you and to all men that we shrunk not from the most rigid investigation of our acts. Joseph also said that I have sent frequent expresses and letters to the governor that Dr. J.R. Wakefield and J.M. Bernheisel and Mr. Sidney Rigdon also had written letters to you, that I had written another letter to you, which was sent on the 15th of June by Mr. James, that I had written again on the 16th of June, enclosing affidavits and sent them by Messrs. Edward Hunter, Philip B. Lewis, and John Bills. Joseph also read Captain Anderson's certificate of the proceedings of the mob at Warsaw. Also, my proclamation, my orders as Lieutenant General to Major General Dunham, the proceedings of the City Council of Nauvoo, and copies of communications forwarded to Springfield. Also, my letter of the 21st of June, which was sent by Dr. Bernheisel and Mr. John Taylor, and my letter of the 22nd, which was sent by Lucian Woodworth and Squire Woods. And at this point, Marshal John P. Greene, quote, explained about giving passes to persons going in and out of the city and denied that any arrests had been made, end quote. So here is Jo making his case to Governor Ford. The original arrest warrant issued by Constable Bettesworth was to be brought before any justice of the peace. Therefore, they had the hearing in Nauvoo, which really was not contrary to the initial arrest warrant that was presented by Constable Bettesworth, but by virtue of the municipal court's construction and how much it was just a kangaroo court under the control of Joseph Smith, it was not satisfactory. That was really at issue here. However, he was immediately discharged upon the first hearing. And then he was advised by Judge Thomas that, hey, you got to do this better. We discussed this in the past episodes. So they brought it before Daniel H. Wells, who was not a baptized member of the church at this time, but he would go on to be a tyrant in Utah. They held it before Esquire Wells, who wasn't officially a member of the church at this time, and he also discharged them. Joseph claims the witnesses were called on both sides. That is just downright false. That is a lie. The only people who were called to witness were people who would say whatever was most beneficial for Joseph Smith. And none of the people who were victims of the crime of the destruction of the expositor, who were caught up in the protests and the riots afterwards, none of them were called to testify. It was not a criminal hearing the way that it should have been handled. It was a kangaroo court that reached the conclusions that it began with, that Joseph Smith could never be victim or be the perpetrator of any crime. So Jo made his case to Governor Ford. He even had John P. Greene there, who was, the city marshal of Nauvoo, to confirm that nobody had been arrested during the martial law declaration, which Governor Ford also knew was a lie, because his previous letter to Joseph Smith, before Joe surrendered, named 3 people who had been arrested, and Governor Ford demanded immediate release of those 3 prisoners. So this was Joe's case, that he didn't do anything wrong, that he had all the documents which showed the exact criminality that he was denying, and then to back up his claim that he didn't do anything criminal, he presented all of those documents to Governor Ford, which proved his criminality. See, Joe wanted this also handled as a civil issue between himself and the owners of the destroyed Expositor Press, not as criminal on charges of inciting riot from the destruction of the printing press and as treason for declaring martial law. Joe really, really, really wanted this to be a civil case, not criminal case, and he really wanted the hearing before Daniel Wells in Nauvoo to satisfy the legal demand to appear in the circuit court at Carthage for all those charges, which would thereby grant him the right of double jeopardy by trying him again in Carthage for the same crimes as were tried in the Nauvoo Municipal Court, which, I will reiterate, he controlled. But everybody involved knew that the whole thing was a sham trial in the Nauvoo Municipal Court, and that wasn't going to hold water. So here's Governor Ford's reply, quote, "The governor referred to the trial before Esquire Wells, which did not satisfy the feelings of the people in and about Carthage. I admit that sufficient time had not been allowed by the posse for the defendants to get ready or to gather their witnesses. You can be very safely admitted that your statements are true, and I'm satisfied now that the people of Nauvoo had acted according to the best of their judgment," end quote. Governor Ford is careful and deliberate with his words here. The Nauvoo counselors and Daniel Wells did act according to their best judgment, but the judgment was flawed. He even admitted that sufficient time wasn't given to the defendants to collect witnesses for them to be brought into Carthage, right? But that also doesn't preclude the fact that the victims of the alleged crime were also not allowed time to collect their witnesses. They weren't even allowed to testify in the Nauvoo municipal hearings in the first place, which renders all of those legal proceedings, according to their best judgment, completely irrelevant. Governor Ford was also sympathetic to the fact that Joe had been told what to do or told to do what he did, I should say, by people who were just trying to gain his favor. And Ford had communicated that to Jo in his initial letter telling the prophet to surrender. If Jo and his city councilors had received bad information from sycophants practicing sophistry just to gain the prophet's favor, they could unwittingly commit crimes while thinking that it was according to their best judgment, as he said. That may have been a reasonable defense at some point, but I don't give it much credence now. Jo knew what he was doing all along, silencing a rival press. And even if individual actions were made out of ignorance, ignorance isn't a defense in a court of criminal law, especially when you are the lieutenant general of a state-sanctioned militia. The conversation among these men continued, and Jo's legal counsel eventually chimes in this exchange that we're about to read. Governor Ford. But Joseph, you had men placed under arrest, detained men as prisoners, and given passes to others, some of which I have seen. John P. Green, City Marshal. Perhaps I can explain. Since these difficulties have commenced, you are aware that we have been placed under very particular circumstance. Our city has been placed under very rigid police guard. In addition to this, frequent guards have been placed outside the city to prevent any sudden surprise. And those guards have questioned suspected or suspicious persons as to their business. To strangers, in some instances, passes have been given to prevent difficulty in passing those guards. It is some of those passes that you have seen. No person, sir, has been imprisoned without a legal cause in our city. Governor, why did you not give a more speedy answer to the posse that I sent out? General Smith, we had matters of importance to consult upon. Your letter showed anything but an amicable spirit. We have suffered immensely in Missouri from mobs and loss of property, imprisonment, and otherwise. It took some time for us to weigh duly these matters. We could not decide upon matters of such importance immediately, and your posse were too hasty in returning. We were consulting for a large people, and vast interests were at stake. We had been outrageously imposed upon, and knew not how far we could trust anyone. Besides, a question necessarily arose, how shall we come? Your request was that we should come unarmed. It became a matter of serious importance to decide how far promises could be trusted, and how far we were safe from mob violence. Here, Governor Ford's personal advisor, Colonel Geddes, chimes in. It certainly did look, from all I have heard, from the general spirit of violence and mobocracy that here prevails, that it was not safe for you to come unprotected. Joe's heard that before. The governor. I think that sufficient time was not allowed by the posse for you to consult and get ready. They were too hasty, but I suppose they found themselves bound by their orders. I think, too, there's a great deal of truth in what you say, and your reasoning is plausible, yet I must beg leave to differ from you in relation to the acts of the city council. That council, in my opinion, had no right to act in a legislative capacity and in that of the judiciary. They should have passed a law in relation to the matter, and then the municipal court, upon complaint, could have removed it. But for the city council to take upon themselves the lawmaking and execution of the law is, in my opinion, wrong. Besides, these men ought to have had a hearing before their property was destroyed. To destroy it without was an infringement of their rights. Besides, it is so contrary to the feelings of American people to interfere with the press. And furthermore, I cannot but think that it would have been more judicious for you to have gone with Mr. Bettesworth to Carthage, notwithstanding the law did not require it. Concerning your being in jail, I'm sorry for that. I wish it had been otherwise. I hope you will soon be released, but I cannot interfere. Joe's counselor, Mr. Reed, said, It was very evident from the excitement created by Mr. Smith's enemies it would have been unsafe for him to come to Carthage, for under such circumstances he could not have had an impartial trial. The governor said, I came here to enforce the laws on all the people, whether Mormons or not, and then expressed his feelings about the destruction of the expositor press. Joseph spoke of his imprisonment in Missouri and of the shameful kidnapping of his witnesses and their being thrust into prison to prevent them from giving their testimony in his favor. Now, I'm sure by this point, Governor Ford kind of had to remove his face from his palm to explain that he's not buying Joe's argument here. Now, the record only states that Governor Ford spoke of the Constitution in response to what Joe said about everything that happened in Missouri. But Governor Ford knew what happened in Missouri during the Missouri Mormon War of 1838, which is why he was handling this matter personally in Carthage in the first place. Governor Ford had seen the consequences of Governor Lilburn Boggs not handling the matter personally, and he was determined to not repeat Boggs's mistakes. Joe's witnesses in Missouri, according to Joseph Smith, they were detained. No, they weren't detained and withheld from testifying in the November trial because the hearing that they had was a court of inquiry. It wasn't a trial. It was just a court of inquiry. That was to determine if there was enough evidence to move forward with fact-finding and the state's prosecuting attorney forming a case against Joe and his fellow lawless banditti. But they escaped prison before the jury trial could even be held, which would have called Joe's witnesses to testify about the events during the Missouri Mormon War. So Governor Ford simply spoke of the Constitution, probably did that to try and teach Joe once and for all about how criminal cases are tried. But of course, Joseph Smith already had his conclusions, and he wasn't going to change his beliefs no matter how much evidence was presented to the contrary of his beliefs. Ford's other point here is notable, though. Joe's counsel echoed the same concerns that Joe had repeatedly told Ford before, that he didn't expect fair trial in Carthage and decided to hold the hearing in Nauvoo for that reason. Governor Ford, being no idiot, recognized that no trial in Nauvoo, which included Joe, was a fair trial, and therefore simply replied prudently that he was there to enforce the laws on all people, Mormons or not, and that Joe should have gone to Carthage even though the law didn't require it. The conversation continues. Joseph said, "We are willing to pay for the press. I do not want the owners to suffer any loss by it, neither do I wish such a libelous paper to be published in Nauvoo. As for calling out the Nauvoo Legion, if it was intended to resist the government of the state, it would be treason, but, as we believe, we were endeavoring to defend ourselves, and had no such intention as to resist the government. It was all right. Our first step, therefore, was to stop the foul, noisome, filthy sheet, and then the next, in our opinion, would have been to have prosecuted the man for a breach of public decency. And furthermore, again, let me say, Governor Ford, I shall look to you for protection. I believe you are talking of going to Nauvoo. If you go, sir, I wish to go along. I refuse not to answer any law, but I do not consider myself safe here." The governor replied, "I am in hopes that you will be acquitted, but if I go to Nauvoo, I will certainly take you along. I do not, however, apprehend danger. I think you are perfectly safe, either here or anywhere else. I cannot, however, interfere with the law. I am placed in peculiar circumstances and seem to be blamed by all parties." Joseph Smith, "Governor Ford, I ask nothing but what is legal. I have a right to expect protection, at least from you, for independent of law. You have pledged your faith and that of the state for my protection, and I wish to go to Nauvoo." The governor, "And you shall have protection, General Smith. I did not make this promise without consulting my officers, who all pledged their honor to its fulfillment. I do not know that I shall go tomorrow to Nauvoo, but if I do, I will take you along." End quote. So Joe's claim there here at the top of that conversation, we weren't trying to resist the government when we declared martial law and refused to comply with multiple arrest warrants. We were just trying to defend ourselves against the law, aka the government, trying to arrest us. That was my own facepalm. I'm sure Governor Ford did as well. I wonder if that statement struck Joe as asinine when he said it as it does when we read it now. Don't worry, Governor Ford. Everything is all right. We weren't just, we weren't resisting the government. We were just resisting the government by declaring martial law. Okay. So that was essentially the material bulk of the conversation between Governor Ford and Joseph Smith at this meeting. And one thing that I want to mention here, it's kind of hard to nail down exactly what was said and what the body language was between Joe and Governor Ford was like, and just generally everything that was shared in this conversation. And I removed some portions from the Willard Richards account that makes up the majority of what is contained in the history of the church, because it's very clearly a propagandized version and it contains obvious expansions from the mouth of Joe that he probably never said. But It was added by Willard Richards and George A. Smith later when it was compiled into the history of the church. But that was the long-awaited interview that Jo sought with Governor Ford to allay the excitement, to answer all of his charges, and to provide explanations that no legal recourse was necessary as no legal wrong had been committed. However, Jo did state immediately after Governor Ford left that meeting something that was recorded by Richards in his journal for that day, which is a contemporary record and likely very accurate to what Jo said. Quote, Joseph remarked, "I have had a good deal of anxiety about my safety since I left Nauvoo, which I never had before when I was under arrest. I could not help those feelings, and they have depressed me." End quote. Regardless of what the history of the church tells us about how well the meeting went between Governor Ford and Jo, Jo's remarks immediately after reveal a great deal about his immediate impressions after that conversation. He's anxious. He's depressed. He can't help these feelings. Governor Ford was clearly not one to be easily swayed by partisanship and the mob mentality that was prevailing among Jo, his friends, and his enemies here. Ford seems to have clearly understood what happened, what was going on, and what Jo was telling him, and Governor Ford already knew how best to act in response to this information. Now, whether or not this conversation influenced Ford's actions, that can't be known, but I'm sure it allowed him to view the situation more completely than he did before, once he was able to get Jo's side of the story from Joseph Smith himself. That conversation that we just read through was the last time that Joseph Smith and Governor Ford would ever speak. The men inside the Carthage debtor's apartment where the meeting took place, that's the larger of the two rooms on the second floor of the Carthage jail. Once Governor Ford left, they decided to take stock of the safety of the room. And it was clear when they took a look around that the guards outside the Carthage jail were the people, the safety measure that was keeping the prisoners from escaping because the locking mechanism on the door to the cell was broken. Quote, "Most of the forenoon was spent by Dan Jones and Colonel Stephen Markham in hewing with a penknife a warped door to get it on the latch, thus preparing to fortify the place against any attack." End quote. They were only marginally successful with repairing this because the latch on the door provided very little resistance to the mob, which pushed through that door the following evening. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. They also took serious the charge of every member a missionary during this day, especially when many of the members in the jail cell were high-ranking leaders in the church. Every member a missionary. So they spent a few hours after the meeting with Governor Ford, quote, preaching to the guards, several of whom were relieved before their time was out, end quote. According to Wideout Willard Richards' accounting of this preaching, quote, they admitted they were convinced of the innocence of the prisoners, end quote. Richards even went so far as to claim that some of them left after hearing this preaching while saying, quote, let us go home, boys, for I will not fight any longer against these men, end quote. Now, whether that happened or not, I kind of doubt it. It doesn't really matter, right? The people tasked with guarding the prisoners at Carthage, they were largely citizens of Carthage who viewed the prisoners as their enemies, regardless of anything that the prisoners may have said to them during this day. But similar to the conversation with Governor Ford, Jo wasn't actually as convincing as the record shows us, or else none of the events of June 26th and 27th would have happened, right? But while the prisoners remained in Carthage, it was a time for conversation and personal reflection among them. Wideout Willard Richards spent the majority of this incarceration period recording in his little pocket journal, from which he was able to reconstruct all of this while he was working on the history of the church project. Jo and Hyrum shared a few moments of discussion. Quote, during the day, Hyrum encouraged Joseph to think that the Lord, for his church's sake, would release him from prison. Joseph replied, could my brother Hyrum but be liberated, it would matter so much about me. Poor Rigdon, poor Sidney Rigdon. I just added that. I am glad he has gone to Pittsburgh out of the way. Were he to preside, he would lead the church to destruction in less than 5 years. End quote. That little conversation between Hyrum and Joseph Smith, that's not anywhere in Richard's journal, which is notable because everything in the history of the church that precedes and follows that little chunk is all straight from Richards' journal. This was added later because Hinchman Sidney Rigdon held a legitimate claim to the throne, which Bloody Brigham Young considered a threat. Now, I've heard people today trot out this line from Jo that he said that Rigdon would lead the church to destruction. But there's no evidence that Jo ever said that. Those words were put in Jo's mouth posthumously by the Salt Lake City leadership. Notably as well, the fatalist leaning in many of Jo's words here, they're all post hoc as well. His contemporary words and his letters are far more lighthearted and optimistic about the outcome of this whole affair. But Whiteout Willard Richards and George A. Smith, they added many statements to Jo's stay in Carthage that make it seem like he knew that he was about to die as a martyr. Lies and propaganda as history aside, the day was still young. This was only mid-morning that we've gone to so far. Legal counsel for Jo and his friends charged that the original mitimus that incarcerated them in Carthage, that it was illegitimate, and to continue holding the prisoners in Carthage jail was based on that illegitimate document. So the charge of treason against Jo and Hyrum needed a separate hearing to determine if they would continue to be held in Carthage jail or they'd be released on habeas corpus for lack of criminal charges. From the History of the Church, quote, "One of the counsel for the prosecution expressed a wish to Esquire Reed," that's Jo's legal counsel, "that the prisoner should be brought out of jail for examination on the charge of treason. He was answered that the prisoners had already been committed until discharged by due course of law, and therefore the justice and constable had no further control of the prisoners, and that if the prosecutors wished the prisoners to be brought out of jail, they might bring them out on a writ of habeas corpus or some other due course of law when we would appear and defend," end quote. So Jo's counsel was relatively optimistic about the outcome of this forthcoming examination of whether or not they should continue to be incarcerated in Carthage jail or they would be released on a writ of habeas corpus. Quote, "Counselor Reed said that he had got the magistrate on a pinhook, for the magistrate had committed them without examination and had no further jurisdiction in the case, and he would not agree to a trial unless Captain Justice R.F. Smith would consent to go to Nauvoo for examination, where witnesses could be had," end quote. So the argument that Hugh T. Reed was telling Jo about here was essentially that they had been committed to Carthage jail without determining if there was any merit in the original charges of treason that were filed by Henry Norton and Augustine Spencer against Jo and Hyrum. In order to determine if there was any merit, Hugh T. Reed, Jo's legal counsel, believed that the Justice R.F. Smith, would have to convey the prisoners to Nauvoo to hold the trial there, where they could examine witnesses about the charges of treason and the declaration of martial law. This would be a massive advantage on the part of Jo and Hyrum because they'd be playing on home turf. And as we've seen many times throughout Nauvoo history, witnesses could be produced for any desired outcome in Nauvoo. So amidst this meeting between the prisoners and their legal counsel, Hugh T. Reed, the town of Carthage took lunch. It was getting later in the day. And as expected, Governor Ford was surrounded by anti-Mormons, hell-bent on vigilante justice. Quote, "It was common conversation on the campground and in the dining room of the hotel in the presence of Governor Ford, quote, 'The law is too short for these men, but they must not be suffered to go at large,' and 'if the law will not reach them, powder and ball must,' end quote." So while we all know the outcome of these legal proceedings and what transpired the following day, the outcome was far less certain for the people who were living through this. It was a constant fear in the minds of the anti-Mormons that Jo was somehow going to get out of these legal troubles like he'd gotten out of every other legal battle that he had faced before. It was equally feared by Jo and his friends that this time the charges would actually stick and that Jo had worn out his Teflon coating. If Jo somehow weaseled his way out of the legal system again, the old citizens of Hancock County would make sure that no legal maneuvers would save him from deserved justice and the death penalty. They would take vigilante justice. Jo and his friends wanted the previous hearings in Nauvoo to prevail, and if they could get this case transferred back to Nauvoo, they'd undoubtedly win the legal fight once again, and then they would roam free. They would walk. They would continue devising the Mormon Revolution of America. So with all that said, with these two competing interests here, with all of this, there was a lot on the line in the afternoon of June 26th and this hearing. Quote, 2:30, Constable Bettesworth came with Alexander Simpson and wanted to come in with an order to the jailer demanding the prisoners committed to his charge. He refused to give them up until discharged from his custody by due course of law. End quote. All right, so what happened here? Well, Bettesworth appeared to the jailer, and the jailer refused him. The legitimacy of every document produced by anybody here was rightfully being challenged. Until Constable Bettesworth could prove that the order to remove the prisoners from the jail that afternoon was legitimate, he wasn't going to let him go. He wasn't going to let the prisoners out of his custody because if something bad happened to him, he'd be on the hook. It could be a plot by Joe's friends for the prisoners to escape, or it could be a plot by the anti-Mormons to assassinate the prisoners right then and there in the town square. The jailer, Stiegel, he was a smart guy. He was smart to refuse the order until it was proven legitimate. However, this also had the effect of exciting the militia outside the jail, who expected Constable Bettesworth to enter the jail with that order to bring Joe to the hearing, but then he exited the jail without Joseph Smith in handcuffs behind him. When he left the jail upon the refusal of the jailer to deliver the prisoners, all the men in the town square who were waiting to see Joseph Smith again, they viewed this as yet another act of opposition. So Joe immediately sent a letter to his legal counselors, James Wood and Hugh T. Reed, quote, "Sirs, Constable Bettesworth called a little while since and wanted to come in. The guard would not let him. We have since learned that he wanted to take us before the magistrate, and we have since learned that there is some excitement because we did not go, and we wish to see you without delay. We are informed that Dr. Robert D. Bob the Builder Foster has said that they can do nothing with us, only powder and ball, as we have done nothing against the law. Yours, signed, Joseph Smith." End quote. "Get over here now. They're about to kill us. James Woods, Hugh T. Reed, get over here." Now, this all caused a huge cloud of chaos to descend over the city. Everybody lost their minds, right? And Judge Robert F. Smith, that's R.F. Smith, wanted to hold this preliminary hearing for treason to answer the charge that the original minimus that committed them to Carthage jail was based on valid charges. And therefore, the minimus, the original minimus, was valid, and they were in Carthage jail on valid charges to begin with. So when the jailer refused to give up the prisoners, Justice Robert F. Smith told Governor Ford about the situation. Quote, "Justice Robert F. Smith then inquired what he must do. Governor Ford replied, 'We have plenty of troops. There are Carthage Greys under your command. Bring them out.'" End quote. Governor Ford's word carries the day. And accordingly, 40 minutes after the constable first showed up to take the prisoners before Justice Robert F. Smith, and all of this chaos started, Constable Bettesworth came back with the Carthage Greys, who'd shown themselves to be a bit more headstrong against Governor Ford's orders the previous day and a half. But, of course, now they're dragging Joseph Smith out of jail to a criminal hearing. Of course, they're going to be compliant with these orders. Quote, 20 minutes to 4, upon the refusal of the jailer to give up the prisoners, the constable with the company of Carthage Greys under the command of Frank Worrell marched to the jail and by intimidation and threats compelled the jailer against his will and conviction of duty to deliver Joseph and Hyrum to the constable, who forthwith and contrary to their wishes compulsorily took them. Joseph, seeing the mob gathered and assuming a threatening aspect, concluded it best to go with them then. End quote. So Justice Governor Ford and Justice Morrison had concluded before, and now Joe seemed to realize the jail was the safest place for them. And all the chaos that was started by their refusal to go with the constable that caused all this chaos, Joe's now being dragged kicking and screaming to this hearing through the city square of Carthage, where over 1,000 armed men wanted him dead. And he didn't have the cover of the jail walls for them to breach before committing the assassination. There was nothing stopping any one of them from cracking off a shot at this guy. Quote, putting on his hat, Joseph walked boldly into the midst of a hollow square of the Carthage Greys, yet evidently expecting to be massacred in the streets before arriving at the courthouse, politely locked arms with the worst mobocrat he could see, and Hyrum locked arms with Joseph, followed by Dr. Richards and escorted by a guard. Elders Taylor, Jones, Markham, and Fulmer followed outside the hollow square and accompanied them to the courthouse. End quote. I assume singing Skip to My Lou, My Darling along the way, doing the little can skipping as they all locked arms and they're just a bunch of friends here. No, I mean, they were on the edge of being assassinated right here. Now, this hearing was to formally charge Hyrum and Joseph Smith with treason by the complaints which had imprisoned them in Carthage jail the previous evening. Now, they didn't get assassinated right then and there when they were extremely vulnerable and surrounded by enemy militias and escorted by the Carthage Greys. Why? Governor Ford was in town. Governor Ford was in town, so Daddy was keeping an eye on everything that was going on, and he was ensuring that good order was followed. So they didn't assassinate Joseph Smith right there in the town square when he was most vulnerable. Quote, 4 o'clock. Case called by Robert F. Smith, captain of the Carthage Greys. The counsel for the prisoners then appeared and called for subpoenas for witnesses on the part of the prisoners and expressed their wish to go into examination as soon as the witnesses could be brought from Nauvoo to Carthage. This was objected to most vehemently by the opposite counsel, end quote. So, they wanted to immediately hold the hearing here. Something that's super interesting here, and we'll discuss what the result of this is. Robert F. Smith was acting as captain of the Carthage Greys and holding this hearing based on charges of treason against the generals Joseph and Hyrum. The outcome of this hearing could be a court-martial for execution. If Robert F. Smith is practicing as a justice of the peace for the circuit court of Carthage, this is a criminal hearing. This is a civil suit. This is a civil criminal hearing. If he is acting as captain of the Carthage Greys, this is a court-martial. The laws regarding and governing court-martials are vastly different than that which govern civil cases and civil criminal charges. If Robert F. Smith came down with a judgment in this hearing that they were guilty, this could be considered a court-martial and they could be executed that night, as they were introduced as Generals Joseph and Hyrum Smith. So, this was objected to vehemently by the opposite counsel. They didn't want to go into examination as soon as possible, as soon as witnesses could be brought from Nauvoo to Carthage. They wanted some time to prepare, and they wanted this to be considered a civil criminal suit, not a court-martial, which it is kind of looking like that's what this is. Now, why did they object to it? Did they object because they wanted more witnesses or more time, or because Hugh T. Reed asked to transfer the case to Nauvoo, where at that point they could call witnesses from within the city, as he stated in his previous meeting with Jo and the boys? I find the latter explanation more plausible here. The last thing that the citizens of Carthage wanted was for this case to go to Nauvoo, where it would be swept away and the prisoners would walk free. That was exactly what the prisoners themselves wanted. They wanted this to be handled in Nauvoo because the previous 2 hearings that they had on all these charges had dismissed them. But the thing is simply having witnesses at the Carthage trial here, that would make plenty of sense, right? And that would be expected. That's the expected due process of law. Bring witnesses from Nauvoo to Carthage, handle this at the circuit court level. So the court deliberated for a while about whether or not the original minimus, based on the charges of Henry Norton and Augustine Spencer of treason, whether or not that original minimus was actually legitimate. And one thing that came to be at issue here was there was a discrepancy in the date of the minimus that was signed by Justice Robert F. Smith versus the minimus that Constable Bettesworth issued to the prisoners in Hamilton's hotel that he used to lock them up in Carthage. That was a moot point, however, because the available minimus that committed them to prison until a full jury trial could be heard, it just ended up being legitimate. It was served on them. They were arrested. They were brought to Carthage. They challenged it. The challenge didn't go through. So the counsel, on behalf of the state, so we've talked about Hugh T. Reed. We've talked about James Woods, the guys who were the counsel for the prisoners, for Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith, and his friends here. But the counsel on behalf of the state, the prosecuting attorneys, and their various legal counselors, it is amazing. The prosecuting attorney for this case that's heard before Captain of the Carthage Greys, Robert F. Smith, the prosecuting attorney was, once again, Chauncey L. Higbee. Chauncey L. Higbee was qualified to serve as a prosecuting attorney for the state, but he was far from an independent and unbiased prosecutor in the case because it concerned what happened after his expositor printing press was destroyed. That was his press. And he had repeatedly tangled with Jo in the Nauvoo court system before. Also, on the prosecuting legal counsel, there was a guy named Onias Skinner, who hasn't come up in our timeline before, but he was a member of the anti-Mormon political party. Also on the legal defense team, the legal prosecuting team, Sylvester Emmons, the editor of the Nauvoo Expositor, and Thomas Morrison was on the prosecuting legal counsel. Thomas Morrison was the original justice who had issued the original arrest order that Jo defied in Nauvoo the day after the expositor was destroyed. So the final name on the state's legal counsel for prosecuting is absolutely remarkable. If this isn't the who's who of anti-Mormons and enemies of Joseph Smith, the last name on this list is fantastic. He's a guy that we've talked about on the show a ton because of his frequent and scathing reports against the Mormons in his newspaper, the Warsaw Signal. Yes, Thomas Coke Sharp, the ultimate anti-Mormon, one of the founders of the anti-Mormon political party and a recipient of a death threat by Hyrum Smith. That Thomas Coke Sharp served as the final member of the prosecuting counsel here. This is the honor roll of anti-Mormons. And they were going to remain the state's legal counsel in the coming jury trial for treason that would result after this criminal hearing to determine if there were enough charges for the state to pursue a case that was being held or heard by Justice Robert F. Smith. So what's interesting, all I could say here is all of these guys had conflicts of interest here and they should have all recused themselves from this case. But these guys viewed the Mormon problem created by Joseph Smith as a personal affront to their own liberties. So none of these guys were ever going to let this case slip through their hands if they had the opportunity to throw the book at Joseph Smith and send him to the gallows in this case. Also, if we consider the legal landscape, Joe's little criminal empire had its own little sham court system there that the due process of law could never be ensured, and he had been able to sweep dozens of legitimate criminal cases under the rug. So if Joseph Smith can turn a blind eye to that, maybe he can withstand a slightly biased court that's biased against him for once, instead of biased to seeing him as the perfect prophet, right? So Joe's counsel, James Woods Esquire, in this hearing stated in the court, quote, "They were committed to jail without any examination whatever," end quote. After which Hugh T. Reed, the other counselor for Joe and his buddies, quote, urged a continuance of the case till the witnesses could be obtained from Nauvoo for the defense, end quote. So this hearing, whether or not it was a court-martial, it really wasn't because of the result, but it was just to determine if the prisoners should remain in Carthage jail because the state had enough evidence to seek discovery and witnesses based on the charges of treason. The problem was no witnesses were available from Nauvoo, and they couldn't be produced any moment before the next afternoon. And that was only if a writer was sent from Carthage immediately after the hearing to go and immediately subpoena those witnesses so that they could head out the very next morning. The earliest that the prosecution could undertake a trial with witnesses on behalf of Joseph Smith would be the next day at noon. Quote, Mr. Onias Skinner, he's one of the prosecuting attorneys, suggested that the court adjourn until 12 o'clock tomorrow. Mr. Woods, one of the defense attorneys, proposed that the court adjourn until witnesses could be got together or until tomorrow at any time, and again adjourn if they are not ready without bringing the prisoners into court, end quote. So the witnesses were probably named here, but the thing is, this is all immediately, quickly scratched in Whiteout Willard Richards' journal. He didn't seem to catch all their names, or he couldn't write fast enough or whatever. The hearing itself took less than an hour for them to come to the determination of it. There was a lot of confusion here, so I don't blame Richards' journal record for being a little bit light here. But understandably, Nauvoo citizens didn't know what was going on in Carthage at this time, and when they received a subpoena to appear in Carthage, where they may or may not have learned that Jo and Hyrum were in jail for treason, what would those people think, right? Joseph Smith had prepped the Mormons for war, and the Carthaginians were the sworn enemies of the Mormons. Would those people who Joe's legal counsel applied to be witnesses, would they even comply with the subpoenas to begin with? Or would they think it as fake legal documents and not comply with the subpoenas and refuse to go to Carthage, the way that Joseph Smith had refused to go to Carthage for 2 weeks? So, understandably, quote, Mr. Reed, defense attorney on Joe's behalf, hoped no compulsory measures would be made use of by the prosecution in this enlightened country, end quote. Basically, Mr. Reed says, subpoena the witnesses, but don't arrest them, right? They're going to comply without the use of force. So, it shouldn't be compulsory. Just hand them a piece of paper and don't shoot them with tear gas or rubber bullets or run them over with an SUV. They're not going to resist. This is an enlightened age. You don't have to use physical violence to enforce the law here. It's an enlightened country. No compulsory measures are necessary for the people who are calling as witnesses. Mr. Skinner chimes in on behalf of the state, one of the prosecuting attorneys, quote, if witnesses cannot be had after due diligence by the defense, a continuance will be granted, end quote. And then the hearing concluded, quote, on a motion of counsel for the prisoners, examination was postponed till tomorrow at 12 o'clock noon, and subpoenas were granted to get witnesses from Nauvoo 20 miles distance, whereupon the prisoners were remanded to prison with the following minimus. And then it prints a new minimus that was signed by Justice Robert F. Smith, captain of the Carthage Greys that day, and it was based on the continuance of the trial until the next day at noon. After which, the prisoners were, quote, returned to jail, and Joseph and Hyrum were thrust into close confinement, end quote. So at this point, the rest of the prisoners, Richards, Taylor, Fulmer, Dan Jones, Piggybank Stephen, Markham, they were all placed back in the debtor's jail apartment, with Joseph and Hyrum Smith in the prison cells in the adjacent room, because they were the ones who had committed treason that the state was going to try and prosecute the next day beginning at noon. So upon hearing of this increased security of putting just Jo and Hyrum in the prison cells, whatever the reasons for doing it, Governor Ford sent an order to the jailer, quote, I would advise the jailers to keep the Mr. Smith in the room in which I found them this morning, unless a closer confinement should be clearly necessary to prevent an escape, end quote. So it seems that locking, Willard Richards and John Fulmer and John Taylor and those other guys up in the debtor's jail, that was just where they needed to be for their own safety, and B, to make sure that they don't escape. But throwing Joseph and Hyrum in the cells, in the jail cells, that seemed like it was excessive punishment without any justification. And at the end of the day, Governor Ford was there to enforce the laws. He could recognize that this was excessive punishment, that they didn't need to be in those prison cells. So he said, hey, I see what you did there. Put them back where you found them. Put them back where they were. They didn't escape last night. They're not going to escape tonight. Put them back there. Unless you really legitimately think that they're going to escape, then you can put them in the jail cells. But until then, just leave them in the debtor's prison. They're going to be fine in that upper apartment. So that was the hearing. A new minimus was issued. They were re-incarcerated in Carthage jail for the second time in 24 hours. After this hearing, which Jo and Hyrum somehow survived without being assassinated, a curious old man entered the city of Carthage. Now, this man was largely unknown by any of the residents of the city, most of the citizens of the local Mormon settlement counties, but he was a welcome sight for the prisoners to see when they were looking out the windows of the jail cell. Uncle John Smith. Jo and Hyrum's uncle had received the letter from Jo a week and a half ago to only give up the arms of the Mormons living in Macedonia if the militia pried those guns from the Mormons' cold dead fingers. So this old man, John Smith, approached the jail in view of Jo and Hyrum looking out the window and seeing it. Quote, Patriarch John Smith came from Macedonia to the jail to see his nephews, Joseph and Hyrum. The road was thronged with mobbers. 3 of them snapped their guns at him, and he was threatened by many others who recognized him. The guard at the jail refused him admittance. Joseph saw him through the prison window and said to the guard, "Let the old gentleman come in. He is my uncle." The guard replied that they did not care who the hell he was uncle to. He should not go in. Joseph replied, "You will not hinder so old and infirm a man as he is from coming in," and then said, "Come in, uncle." On which, after searching him closely, the guard let him pass into the jail where he remained about an hour. He asked Joseph if he thought he should again get out of the hands of his enemies, when he replied, "My brother Hyrum thinks I shall. I wish you would tell the brethren in Macedonia that they can see by this that it has not been safe for me to come visit them." I assume when he says this, it's italicized. He's like pointing to the fact that he's in jail, right? "And tell Almon Babbit I want him to come and assist me as an attorney at my expected trial tomorrow before Captain R.F. Smith." Father, Uncle John Smith, then left the jail to convey this message to A.W. Babbit, who was at Macedonia. End quote. So that was the little meeting between John Smith and his nephews. Uncle John, he's known as, very widely in Utah, he was referred to as Uncle John. And his son would go on to be prophet, as would his grandson, Joseph F. Smith and Joseph Fielding Smith. So Almon Babbit would arrive in Carthage by the next day to stand on Joseph's legal counsel as a defense attorney. But he did so carrying a very unexpected message with him. Now, we got to wait before we're able to discuss that message specifically. I just find it incredibly remarkable. But Uncle John did end up meeting Almon Babbit on the road back to Macedonia, and he told Babbit of Jo's request. And Babbit replied to Uncle John cryptically, quote, "You are too late. I am already engaged on the other side," end quote. Other side of what? What was Almon Babbit saying in reply to John Smith? Was he working with the enemies, or was he engaged in Macedonia with Illinois militias occupying the city, and maybe he didn't think that it was prudent to leave the city for Carthage? What did he mean by that? "You are too late. I'm already engaged on the other side." He said that, but Almon Babbit did end up making it to Carthage the next day and met with Joseph Smith with an unexpected message in his pocket. Now, we'll never know what was actually meant by that statement. "You are too late. I'm already engaged on the other side." We'll never know what was meant by that, because it was probably a fabrication by the compiler of the history of the church, George A. Smith, who wrote that line after Almon Babbit had been excommunicated from the Salt Lake City church merely months before he was mysteriously killed in Nebraska Territory in 1856. "You are too late. I am already engaged on the other side." What does that mean? The power of historical propaganda, the tendrils in many times are invisible, but they are extant and powerful. After Uncle John's visit and, he headed back to Macedonia, Joseph Smith received a much appreciated letter from his personal scribe, Quilliam Claypen. And Quilliam Claypen was the same guy that Jo instructed 3 days prior to burn or bury the Council of 50 Minutes. So the letter that Jo received is interesting, as there appears to be coded language here. And using coded language wasn't uncommon among the Mormon leadership. They called it the Council of Yitfif because the Council of 50 was too secretive, right? When the Mormons were stealing Missourians' property during the Missouri-Mormon War of 1838, they were instructed to call the hogs that they stole bears and the cattle that they stole buffalo, right? I mean, so some language in Claypen's letter here to Joseph Smith could also be coded or cryptic language that only Joseph and William Claypen were able to decipher. Here's the letter, quote, "Dear President, I write this line to inform you that Mr. Marsh, Thomas B. Marsh? I wonder who that Mr. Marsh is, who lives down the river and of whom you have had corn, pork, etc., has sent word that if you want any bail, he is ready for one to any amount, and further that he has got some corn left which he wants you to have lest the mob get it. We will endeavor to obtain it. They have already taken 2 loads, but he has charged them $1 a bushel for it. The Amaranth, that's a steamer, has just landed at the foot of Main Street and unloaded 200 barrels flour, 95 for Mr. Kimball, the balance for Bryant." Like, why couldn't this wait? This is a letter just talking about the barrels of flour and some guy who proposes that he has some corn and pork, right? That they've already taken 2 loads of corn, apparently, and he wants $1 a bushel for each of them. It's very odd. The rest of the letter's more consequential. It says, quote, "Captain Singleton, who came at the head of the police this morning, is sending a request to the governor to call them home. He says he finds no difficulties to settle here, but there is plenty to settle at home. He furthermore says that while the police were at Carthage, they were treated as soldiers, but since they came to Nauvoo, they have been treated as gentlemen. The company all got home safe and well last night. A messenger is about to start forthwith to Judge Thomas. All is peace in Nauvoo. Many threats keep coming that the mob are determined to attack the city in your absence, but we have no fears. With fervency and true friendship, I remain yours eternally, signed William Clayton," end quote. Yours eternally. Maybe Clayton was adopted by Joseph Smith. Upon reading the letter from William Claypen, Joe sent the messenger, Joel S. Miles, back to Nauvoo with a list of documents to bring to Carthage for the hearing at noon tomorrow. Joe also, quote, "sent a message to his legal counselor, James Woods, to get subpoenas for Samuel James, Edward Hunter, and Philip B. Lewis with instructions to bring with them the papers that they carried to the governor at Springfield and which the governor had not seen, as he had started for Carthage before they arrived at Springfield," end quote. So all of these were witnesses. They were all documents that Joe was sending Joel S. Miles back to Nauvoo with to bring to Carthage immediately for the hearing at noon tomorrow, right? So he sent out for all those things in Nauvoo. And then Joe and the rest of the city of Carthage, they took supper close to 8 p.m. After dinner, however, Jo and Hyrum were visited in the debtor's apartment of the Carthage jail by their legal counsel, James Woods and Hugh T. Reed. And those counselors brought some interesting information with them concerning a meeting that they had just attended with Governor Thomas Ford. Now, a decision had been made which would prove incredibly consequential to the point of being a fatal decision. Quote, "Counselors Woods and Reed called with Elder J.P. Green and said that the governor and military officers had held a council which had been called by the governor, and they decided that the governor and all the troops should march to Nauvoo at 8 o'clock tomorrow, except one company of about 50 men, in order to gratify the troops and return the next day. The company of 50 men to be selected by the governor from those troops of whose fidelity he could most rely on to guard the prisoners who should be left in Carthage jail, and that their trial be deferred until Saturday the 29th, end quote. So, the original minimus that was issued by Justice Robert F. Smith, captain of the Carthage Greys, that said that the hearing would occur on noon of June 27th, and it was just silently amended to read June 29th instead. Quote, "This was done without consulting either the prisoners or their counselor," end quote. So it was decided that the hearing was going to happen on June 29th instead of June 27th, meaning that the prisoners would languish in prison in June, Mississippi River, Illinois heat for 2 days longer than expected. And most importantly, Governor Ford would personally march a small contingent of his militia forces into Nauvoo in order to collect documents and witnesses and to get a finger on the pulse of the city. He was going to leave tomorrow morning sometime, leaving only 50 of his most trusted guards in Carthage to make sure that nothing bad happened to the prisoners. Without Governor Ford in Carthage, and without taking Joseph Smith with him to Nauvoo, the foxes are guarding the henhouse. The decision was made. Governor Ford would not be taking the prisoners with him to Nauvoo as he had told Joseph Smith that he would. They were too much of a liability to carry to Nauvoo and attempt to bring back to Carthage once their business was concluded in Nauvoo. So let's hear a bit from Governor Ford about the decision-making process which led him to go to Nauvoo on the morning of the 27th, because the correct choice amidst all of this public fury and confusion and people wanting to assassinate Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith wanting to run and escape prison, the correct decision was anything but clear. Not all but clear. It was anything but clear. From Governor Ford's History of Illinois, quote, "All of these considerations," I'll add, of a possible Illinois Mormon war, that's the context of this paragraph, "were duly urged by me upon the attention of a council of officers convened on the morning of the 27th of June. I also urged upon the council that such a wanton and unprovoked barbarity," meaning waging war against Nauvoo, "on their part would turn the sympathy of the people in the surrounding counties in favor of the Mormons, and therefore it would be impossible to raise a volunteer militia force to protect such a people against the Mormons. Many of the officers admitted that there might be danger of collision, but such was the blind fury prevailing at the time, though not showing itself by much visible excitement, that a small majority of the council adhered to the first resolution of marching into Nauvoo. Most of the officers of the Schuyler and McDonough militia voting against it, and most of those of the county of Hancock voting in its favor." Marching a militia to go in and destroy Nauvoo. That's what he's talking about. He goes on to say, "A very responsible duty now devolved upon me, to determine whether I would, as commander-in-chief, be governed by the advice of this majority. I had no hesitation in deciding that I would not, but on the contrary, I ordered the troops to be disbanded, both at Carthage and Warsaw, with the exception of 3 companies, 2 of which were retained as a guard to the jail, and the other was retained to accompany me to Nauvoo." End quote. So not only did Governor Ford not listen to the majority of militiamen saying that he should march to Nauvoo with the entirety of the state's militia forces, but he went so far as to disband the 1,300 some odd militiamen in Carthage and Warsaw at the time and send them all home so that he could handle this issue without the constant presence of militias making everything more urgent and complicated. He disbanded the Illinois militias. In many ways, this is understandable because he had disbanded the Nauvoo Legion and he had seized their state-provided arms. That was a unilateral disarmament. Now he was disbanding the state militias as well. It was an armistice amidst not an active war. Just an area, a location that was teetering on the edge of a war. He disarmed both militias, with the exception of 2 companies that would remain in Carthage and 1 that would go with him to Nauvoo the next morning. Governor Ford continues, "The officers insisted much in council upon the necessity of marching to that place, Nauvoo, in search for apparatus to make counterfeit money." Because, of course, counterfeit money stuff comes into this, right? "And more particularly to ease their terrors on this head. I proposed to them that I would myself proceed to the city, accompanied by a small force, make the proposed search, and deliver an address to the Mormons, and tell them plainly what degree of excitement and hatred prevailed against them in the minds of the whole people, and that if any open or secret violence should be committed on any persons or property of those who had taken part against them, that no one would doubt but that it had been perpetrated by them, and that it would be the sure and certain means of the destruction of their city and the extermination of their people. I ordered 2 companies under the command of Captain R.F. Smith of the Carthage Greys to guard the jail. In selecting these companies, and particularly the company of the Carthage Greys for this service, I have been subjected to some censure. It has been said that this company had already been guilty of mutiny and had been ordered to be arrested whilst in the encampment at Carthage, and that they and their officers were the deadly enemies of the prisoners. Indeed, it would have been difficult to find friends of the prisoners under my command unless I had called the Mormons as a guard, and this, I was satisfied, would have led to immediate war and the sure death of the prisoners." End quote. So Governor Ford, for the security of his prisoners, he disbanded the militias because they weren't needed, right? And he refused to march a large force into Nauvoo except for himself and a small company to search for the counterfeit machinery and to deliver a speech telling the Mormons that they're on thin ice. And then he left only a very small contingent, 2 companies, of the Carthage Greys under the command of one guy that he trusted in order to guard the prisoners while he was in Nauvoo. What else could he do? Governor Ford said it himself. He couldn't find anybody to guard the prisoners who weren't their enemies unless he called the Nauvoo Legion to do the job, which would immediately escalate tensions and result in war, including the deaths of Joseph and Hyrum Smith. Ford continues, quote, "Although I knew that this company were the enemies of the Smiths, yet I had confidence in their loyalty and integrity because their captain, R.F. Smith, was universally spoken of as a most respectable citizen and honorable man. I relied upon this company especially because it was an independent company, for a long time instructed and practiced in military discipline and subordination. I also had their word and honor, officers and men, to do their duty according to law. Besides all this, the officers and most of the men resided in Carthage, in the near vicinity of Nauvoo, and, as I thought, must know that if they would make themselves and their property convenient and conspicuous marks of Mormon vengeance in case they were guilty of treachery." Now, that's a really great point that Governor Ford made there. If the Carthage Greys, he puts them in power to guard Joseph Smith. If they assassinate Joseph Smith, the Mormons would know. And the property of the people who were guarding the Smiths, that was the property of the people who were closest to the Mormon settlement, and the Mormons would wreak their vengeance on that property first. But of course, Governor Ford also had many other demons on his shoulders attempting to influence his decision-making here. Quote, "I must here be permitted to say also that frequent appeals have been made to me to make a clean and thorough work of the matter by exterminating the Mormons or expelling them from the state. An opinion seemed generally to prevail that the sanction of executive authority would legalize the act. Why would people think that? Because it had worked in Missouri, maybe, against the Mormons? So if it were to happen under Governor Ford, it would be like it happened under Governor Boggs, and the Mormons would never receive any reparations, and nobody would receive any legal recourse for what had happened. So, of course, that's what they thought." He continues. "And all persons of any influence, authority, or note who conversed with me on the subject frequently and repeatedly stated their total unwillingness to act without my direction or in any mode except according to law. So they wouldn't commit to exterminating the Mormons as the Missourians had done unless they had Governor Ford's stamp of approval." He continues. "This was a circumstance well calculated to conceal from me the secret machinations on foot. I had constantly contended against violent measures, and so had the Brigadier General in command, and I am convinced that unusual pains were taken to conceal from both of us the secret measures resolved upon." End quote. With all of these pressures tugging Governor Ford in all directions, his resolve to go to Nauvoo provided exactly the window that the assassins needed to put their plan into effect, that they had gone to great measures and, as he says, unusual pains to conceal those secret plans from him as well as his brigadier general. So Ford's decision to not take the prisoners with him on the trip to Nauvoo the following day would echo through the remainder of his career and blight Ford's legacy from that time forward. With this troubling information about Ford's decisions to not take them with him to Nauvoo the next day and to just leave Carthage jail guarded by 2 companies of the Carthage Greys, the prisoners settle into their apartment in the upper story of Carthage jail. Quote, Elder John Taylor prayed. Willard Richards, John Taylor, and John S. Fulmer, Stephen Markham, and Dan Jones stayed with Joseph and Hyrum in the front room. During the evening, the patriarch Hyrum Smith read and commented upon extracts from the Book of Mormon. Oh my God, that's hilarious. Okay. Hyrum Smith cracked open his Book of Mormon and started reading it to Joseph Smith and the other guys there. Why I'm laughing? I've been reading the history of the church for a long time. For, essentially 5 years now. I've been reading out of this 6 volume book series. And never, ever have Hyrum or Joseph Smith read and commented upon extracts from the Book of Mormon to each other. Or discussed stuff about the Book of Mormon. Ever. It took until the night before they were assassinated for them to expound and wax biblical about stuff in the Book of Mormon. What did Hyrum Smith talk about from the Book of Mormon on this, the day before their death? On the imprisonments and deliverance of the servants of God for the gospel's sake. Joseph bore a powerful testimony to the guards, to the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon, to the restoration of the gospel, to the administration of angels, and that the kingdom of God was again established on earth, for the sake of which he was then incarcerated in that prison, and not because he had violated any law of God or man. It's all religious persecution. He's not there because he had violated any laws. He's only imprisoned because everybody else in the world are the devil. They're all led by the adversary. This is all religious persecution. Joseph Smith's career started with persecution resulting from the Gold Bible that became the Book of Mormon. His entire life culminates in this event that is all, of course, only strictly religious persecution. And the Book of Mormon bookends his life in the public sphere. So Joe's ranting concluded that night, and the men resigned to the exhaustion overcoming them as the sun had long set beneath the horizon. They retired to rest late. Joseph and Hyrum occupied the only bedstead in the room, while their friends lay side by side on the mattresses on the floor. Dr. Richards sat up writing until his last candle left him in the dark. And as sleep was about to overcome these men, a very troubling report came from outside. Quote, the report of a gun fired close by caused Joseph to arise, leave the bed, and lay himself on the floor. They wouldn't inquire as to the source of this gunshot until the following morning, but it was understandably upsetting for these men who all feared that their lives are going to be taken by vigilante justice, and it was dark. It was night out. And the infuriated militias who were occupying the city under the careful watch of Governor Ford here. Could Governor Ford keep the peace tonight? He had done it the previous night. He had done it the night before. Could he keep the peace for tonight? Could he keep the peace when he's not in the city, when he leaves for Nauvoo the next morning? Now, a touching and a very iconic moment of Mormon history takes place on Jo and Hyrum's last living night. Quote. After the gun was fired, Joseph lay himself on the floor, having Dan Jones on his left and John S. Fulmer on his right. Joseph laid out his right arm and said to John S. Fulmer, "Lay your head on my arm for a pillow, Brother John." And when all were quiet, they conversed in a low tone about the prospects of their deliverance. Joseph gave expression to several presentiments that he had to die, and said, "I would like to see my family again, and I would to God that I could preach to the saints in Nauvoo once more." Fulmer tried to rally his spirits, saying he thought he would often have that privilege, when Joseph thanked him for the remarks and good feelings expressed to him. Soon after, Dr. Richards retired to the bed which Joseph had left, and when all were apparently fast asleep, Joseph whispered to Dan Jones, "Are you afraid to die?" Dan said, "Has that time come, think you? Engaged in such a cause, I do not think that death would have many terrors." Joseph replied, "You will yet see Wales and fulfill the mission appointed you before you die." End quote. This night of June 26th, 1844, marks the final night Joseph and Hyrum Smith would lay their heads down to sleep. The mad tyrant would be dead before sunset the following day. All right, listeners, let's take a step back and chat for a minute here, okay? The death of Joseph Smith has been an inevitable conclusion that we've been pursuing for 5.5 years on this podcast now. I've lost a lot of sleep, and I've put scores of hours into thinking about how to handle Carthage in a way that will do justice to the literal thousands of hours of research which have gone into constructing our historical timeline in the podcast. I want to be proud of the results. When I'm recording this, Naked Mormonism is ranked 5th in its category on iTunes with over 2.5 million overall downloads. Honestly, I take a lot of pride in those milestones. But that pride also comes with the recognition that the death of Joseph Smith will be the greatest undertaking of this podcast so far. Now, I know that y'all have been waiting years for this moment, just like me, and I want us to get there together, and I want us to feel happy and satisfied with the result of the journey. This is a big event, and that means that we're going to take our time so that I can do this right. And what does right look like? Well, right, in my mind, is a 10-part series over the coming weeks. These are going to be special episodes. 7 of these episodes will be devoted to examining the life of Joseph Smith and early Mormonism through different perspectives and highlighting certain stories and certain aspects. Then episodes 8 through 10 will cover the June 27th assassination of Joseph and Hyrum Smith in the immediate aftermath. So let me give a little forecast here. I've come to understand the listening audience of this podcast falls into 3 pretty broad categories, and I want to speak to each of those categories individually right now. The first category is new listeners who haven't heard the entire backlog of the podcast and they just jump in at an arbitrary point. I want this 10-part series to essentially be an index or a directory to the entire 200-plus episode backlog. So these 10 episodes will contain stories from all over early Mormon history with episode numbers to back them up in case you want to venture into the backlog for a deeper dive. The second category are the casual listeners. Maybe you've listened to the entire backlog. Maybe you skipped a few episodes here and there. You know, y'all usually put the podcast on when you're doing menial tasks, or maybe you want to hear my voice playing in the background while you're falling asleep. Now, you remember a lot of stories from early Mormon history, but a lot of that information isn't readily available upon recall. It's hard to immediately remember it. So this 10-episode series will be a refresher for all of you, and it's going to bring y'all up to speed on the entire 39 years of Joe's life and 14 years of his ministry. And now, the third and final category of listeners, they represent a very small percentage of the audience, but in many ways, they're the listeners to whom I owe the most. These are the listeners who've listened eagerly to every episode as it drops. You've listened to every presentation. You've heard every guest spot or interview that I've done. You've often you are the people who are the supporters of the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. You know more Mormon history than 99% of Mormons will ever know. I want this 10-part series to leave you feeling like we've all collectively arrived to the end of this massive journey together. Through thick and thin, through hardship and leisure, through joy and sorrow, you, small group of extremely devoted listeners, have been with me the longest, and you have been the most supportive, and I've learned the most along this journey from you, amazing people. I owe it to each and every one of you to do the death of Joseph Smith right, which is going to require, and I understand this, patience and tenacity of listening from each and every one of you who have been looking forward to the death of Joseph Smith for years now. So with all that said, the series isn't ready yet, and I refuse to go to air until it's up to my expectations. For at least like the last 15 episodes, we have been rocketing to Carthage, focusing solely on Joseph Smith and leaving a lot of stuff behind. There are so many loose threads and people that I want to catch up with in the timeline. What's Emma been up to for the last couple of months? How's Bloody Brigham Young doing out in the eastern states electioneering for the prophet? What's Eliza R. Snow doing on, living on the Morley settlement while basically running the Relief Society in Emma's absence? What have the publishers of the Expositor been doing since their press was destroyed? We're going to spend the next few episodes drawing all of these threads together to get everything set up for the 10-episode Road to Carthage series. I've left enough behind in the timeline to fill a lot of episodes here, but I also don't want to bore everybody with superfluous details until the 10-part series is ready to air. So I promise I'm not going to keep all of you waiting a second longer than I have to in order to really stick the landing of this series. So that's the podcast forecast for the coming months. Hang in there, listeners. I want to thank all of you for giving me your most precious commodity, your time, and for giving me your support. Now, let's all eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow Joe dies. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.